do. I host a television show and a radio show. So that's what we do.
All right then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Just check out. Okay.
Yeah, you can monitor this because this is the most important shot.
Okay.
Okay, we're rolling. Got one more to roll with.
You been back down in Dallas lately, or?
Oh yeah. I preached for Freddie not too long ago.
Okay.
I talked to him this morning. Well, texted him.
Okay.
He's in D.C. Had to preach at Howard this morning.
Oh, okay.
In Maryland before that.
Okay. Well, first of all, welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you, sir.
I know you come in and out of the city every once in a while.
I do. Now,
Yeah.
do I look at you or the camera?
You can look at me.
Okay. Yeah.
But yesterday you were introduced by Bakari Kitwana.
Right.
So I know that there is a connection there.
Yeah, no doubt.
So yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to express was that I just think that it's such a beautiful thing that you have this understanding of hip-hop culture, the music, you know, to the point where you can actually give us the lyrics to some of those songs.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I'm probably in the same age bracket as you.
Okay, right.
And I have a...
The politician, then the Attorney General of the United States of America. And he had gone on a series of listening tours around the country trying to ferret and figure out, how to speak about big issues, social, political, and moral issues, in ways that would be found compelling to those within government, and figuring out ways to bridge the experiences of those in communities as citizens who are private and they're publicly supported and engaged, government. And so, one of those meetings had to do with the issue of the racial conflagration going on in the country. Kennedy was concerned about what was happening in the North because the North was catching on fire. We knew the South was, deeply and heavily bogged down by its racist preoccupations. But he was worried about the anger of black people in the North and how they were reacting and responding. Or about to react and respond. This was pressing it to a certain degree, and it was long before some of those riots hit Newark and Detroit, and, happened in Watts in '65, even before both of those places. So he was concerned about the northern tenor of the Negro and why it is that they were being attracted to, the Malcolm X's of the world, the radical revolutionary responses to social injustice among black people. So he wanted to kind of figure that out and ferret what was happening behind the scenes. And he had met Baldwin a year before at a meeting of Nobel laureates in the White House, to which both of them were invited. And they hit it off rather nicely and pledged to each other to get together in the future. Then Dick Gregory was meeting with Robert Kennedy off the books, so to speak, trying to give him information, informing him, advising him. And he suggested that, about the issue of race, and he suggested that Kennedy reach out to Baldwin. So things kind of came together. And then Baldwin had fired off a very fiery telegram to the Attorney General blaming him and his brother John F. Kennedy for what was going on in Birmingham. It wasn't just Bull Connor's problem. It was the complicity of an American government that refused to fight on behalf of its most vulnerable citizens. So all that stuff kind of came to a head, and Baldwin was extended an invitation to meet with Kennedy over breakfast. Long story short, the plane was late, Baldwin got in late, Kennedy had to run because he had a meeting. He said, look, I'll be, and they had a nice meeting. Kennedy said, he liked Baldwin a great deal. Baldwin liked him a great deal. They hit it off. Why don't we meet the next day? I'm going to be in New York. And of course, Baldwin lives in New York. Why don't you get together some of those folk? Because he had asked Baldwin in that meeting, who are some of the black people that other black people listen to? Not the civil rights leaders, not Martin Luther King Jr. or Roy Wilkins and them. Those folk, let's talk about other people. So he named Harry Belafonte and Lorraine Hansberry and a few other folk. Well, Baldwin gets on the horn, or somebody for him, and in his name calls these people Lena Horne, comes in, I think the longest from California. Belafonte's there. You know, Clarence Jones comes. Lorraine Hansberry comes. An activist out of New Orleans who turns out to be perhaps the most important person at that meeting, Jerome Smith. He comes. And, you know, the meeting becomes an extraordinary, you know, flashpoint along the trajectory of race relations in this country. It wasn't a public meeting, a private one, but it shaped the thinking of Kennedy thereafter. He was really mad at first because he was going there expecting that they were going to just give him an extended arm, an olive branch of gratitude for, you know, the advance of civil rights under his brother's watch. Olive branch because maybe they had been too hard. That's what, you know, Kennedy might have thought, that, you know, the civil rights community had been hard. Black people had been shamelessly hard on him. Maybe an olive branch would be extended of gratitude, and they'd let him up.
And rightfully so.
And rightfully so, because the Kennedy administration was doing some horrible stuff as well as some interesting stuff. They were never totally committed to civil rights, not fundamentally. And the Kennedy brothers, but especially John, had promised those Southern, you know, governors and politicos that they weren't going to use the authority of the federal government in behalf of these, you know, vulnerable populations, that they would not, you know, they pledged not to intervene on the state's affairs, you know, and that was a big argument, states' rights versus federal authority. And they felt that there was a kind of imposition, that is, white people in the South, of the federal government on their lives, and there was a deep and profound resentment.
And the sons of former slave owners would lose some of their
Power, some of their strongholds, some of their influence, and so on. So, you know, the Kennedy and his aide, Burke Marshall, went to that meeting thinking, oh, we're going to get some love and some kudos, and they beat him down, and Jerome Smith especially led the charge. I'm tired of this pity patter and this polite talk, you know, you know, this is what you're doing is wrong, what you're doing is not satisfactory, and, you know, you're worried about the left, the black left, or radicals or revolutionaries, you know, who are full of anger. You better be worried about a guy like me. He was saying basically Malcolm's people are not going to do anything. They're not going to be politically active. They're already forbade from political activity by Elijah Muhammad. You better be worried about a guy like me, who's an advocate of nonviolence. Both Gandhi and King had influenced him, but he said, I'm about the point where I'm ready to pick up a gun. And when I pull the trigger, it's over. It was astonishing. He lit that room up. Kennedy was resentful, looking toward the elder, more informed Negroes, and Lorraine Hansberry said, look, you know, there are a lot of fashionably famous and prominent black people in this room, but the only man you need to listen to is that guy right there. Sent him right back into the lion's den. And they went back and forth, and finally, you know, Kennedy shut down. He shut up. He was forced to listen to people for 3 hours. They pummeled him and hammered him. And he was angry now. After that meeting, he sicked the FBI on all the people who the FBI had not already been attuned to and alert to. And so Clarence Jones, the former lawyer of Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin, was the lawyer for them then, was in that meeting, and the FBI had already begun to snoop around on King, and, you know, later on King, and then began snooping around on him, and they, you know, they pulled their dossier on Jones and Belafonte and Baldwin and the like. And so this liberal white politician from the North sicked J. Edgar Hoover, one of the most vicious forces within government and law enforcement, and certainly at the helm of the FBI, one of the most influential and negatively so figures in American history, you know, was unleashed on these people. But then Kennedy calmed down and said, you know what, if I were black, I'd probably respond the same way Jerome Smith did, because he lit into Kennedy. And he was the youngest. He was an activist for CORE, you know, Congress of Racial Equality. He was about justice. He was on the front line. He had gotten beaten several times. He and John Lewis were the most storied, you know, figures who endured enormous and massive assaults in the name of black freedom and truthful democracy. So, you know, Kennedy afterward began to appreciate their, their positions. Jerome Smith, Belafonte, and other black people. Lena Horne was there. I've mentioned Lorraine Hansberry, and they did an incredible job of supporting that young man as he led into Kennedy. And Kennedy's anger eventually subsided and gave way to not only concession and recognition that Jerome Smith and the others were right, but that it changed his mind about how best to approach racial reconciliation in this country, and especially racial justice.
So with that being said, in the background that you just gave us, it's no coincidence that Kennedy found himself assassinated. Particularly having that epiphany about how wrong some folks were about us in this country.
There's no question that Jack Kennedy was murdered in '63, but that Robert F. Kennedy, who died 5 years later, had an enormous transformation. And joining his brother in the Fellowship of Martyrs was not something he sought, and yet he was committed to a very different vision of racial justice after that meeting. He got turned around, he got turned on, he began to encourage governments, the government, the big federal government, and then even state governments and local municipalities to take seriously the claim and call of black freedom and liberation and emancipation. He began to check himself about poverty among poor white people, poor black people, and he had a much more open mind. And yeah, he began to struggle with what it meant to be an American. So there's no doubt that given the tense nature of the '60s, where assassinations were brewing and growing out of the ground, whether it was Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King Jr. or his brother John, or then subsequently him. These famous assassinations in the '60s represented the attempt of the nation to adjust itself to these new demands. And there were elements, counterinsurgent elements that sought to control the radical claim of emancipation and liberation for black people. So in that sense, even though Sirhan had in mind, as a Palestinian, Kennedy's identification with Israel and what he thought was too closely aligned, but the man was obviously sick and killing, a man running for the presidency of the United States of America. That aside, there's no question that Kennedy's stalwart commitment and loyal support of civil rights after, his encounters with Baldwin and Jerome Smith and Lorraine Hansberry et al. Certainly made a huge difference in his life.
At the same time, we saw a dramatic shift in the political identity of black people in America, because previous to that, we were probably more aligned with Republican party affiliation. Right. And then with Kennedy and more importantly, Lyndon Baines Johnson, right, you saw that paradigm shift.
Yeah, no doubt. It began under FDR with the New Deal. Black people, as you said, had been Republicans, and Republicans exhaust every means to remind black people about this, especially who are now solidly Democratic. Well, it was the Democrats who did a lot of horrible stuff, and it's the Republicans who support you. But that was the old story, bro. What you've been doing lately? That was 100 and some years ago, right? Lincoln as a Republican, extraordinary. But under FDR, there began to be a shift. The Great Society that LBJ talked about was presaged to a certain degree with the New Deal. And the New Deal certainly helped white people more ever than it helped black people. But black people, with even thrown bones, were grateful for the acknowledgement of the federal government. Because remember, under previous presidents of 100 years before, whether it was after Lincoln, and then when you think about Jackson and Johnson, and you think about many of the presidents who were explicitly racist, think about Wilson, the former president of Princeton, but who was a bigot of the first order. When you think about some of the nativist practices and policies of people around Teddy Roosevelt and the like. So when you think about the development and the evolution of the presidency, there was certainly an embrace of explicit bigotry, and then the diminishing of that, and then the shift in that ability to do so explicitly. And FDR, though he hardly did what he might have done for black people, at least laid out the philosophical architecture upon which the erection of a new destiny, a building of a new destiny for black people could begin to take place. He laid the brick for the foundation for subsequent gestures to be laid upon. And having said that, think about later on Eisenhower with desegregating the military, and then Truman, before him. So when you think about, Truman was before him, I think, right? So when you think about the, extraordinary capacity of, politics to be shaped by race, and then you think about how black people were extremely loyal, even when those parties didn't deserve it, that shift began en masse in significant and substantive numbers under FDR, and then continued in the course, as you say, with LBJ, with the Great Society, and the support for the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act, and then in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in 1968, in homage to King's enormously important life and his martyrdom, then they passed the Fair Housing Act. Well, that's the holy trinity of civil rights legislation in the 60s, and indeed in our country. And that happened all under a Democratic president.
So now we find ourselves in the next century. We find most of us aligned with the Democratic Party. It seems as though those of us who have that affiliation have been taken for granted.
Oh, sure.
What brings you here is an effort to get out the vote. That's one of the things that brings you here,
exactly.
An effort to get out the vote for a Democratic candidate for treasurer in the state of Ohio.
Right.
I'm curious about how much longer as a people we can put all of our hopes and dreams into the hope of a party that will represent us but has seemingly failed us over a long period of time.
Well, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, as Van Hooten said, and that the Democratic Party has very clearly and visibly exploited black people by taking advantage of our loyalty to them, our nearly unconditional loyalty to them, our unchecked allegiance to the Democratic Party. But when we would consider the alternatives, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. So for black people to fail to be Democrat, they could go to the left. They could go further to the left. They could get involved in the Green Party. They could get involved in whatever progressive formation there is. But few of those progressive third-party formations have the potential to affect policy or be effective or get elected. And therefore, it's a vote wasted or a pipe dream, or it's a little more than a symbolic gesture. So we are captive to the Democratic Party to a degree because we're not en masse going to become Republicans. Right? The Republican Party, no matter how bad the Democratic Party is, and it is, the Republicans are far worse. And so we do play a kind of, ethical and moral and political triage. What's bleeding worse? How do we fix it? How do the Democrats help us fix it? How do we support them because we don't want to turn to the right? For instance, I debated many fellow black leftists in this past election in 2016, and many of them were telling me, well, there's no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. In what world? In what world? If Noam Chomsky, a known leftist, and Angela Davis, a known leftist and revolutionary, could choose Hillary Clinton to support her, then so can you, so can we. Now, is it perfect? No. But we would be able to hold them accountable far more likely than we can hold Donald Trump. We have no juice with Donald Trump. And Kanye is not our representative. Or Jim Brown, God bless him, is not our representative. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if we deny the Democrats our votes, then we suffer as well under a Republican presidency that has no interest in supporting us. If the Democrats get our vote, then they take us for granted and then don't extend to us the same kind of political concern that they do to other communities. And look what happened when the Democrat representative was also one of us, a black man, when Barack Obama was president. It was arguably even worse. We got probably far less from him than we have other Democrats. And he's a black man who happens to be a Democrat. So when you factor in the complicated politics of race, it is true that, that black people seem to be captive to our disadvantage to a Democratic Party that is all too willing to, exploit us for its own purposes and to cast us aside when it's no longer useful. That hurts, that's painful, but what is the choice? Could we generate a third party? Yeah. Would it have the potential to make a difference and get elected? Probably not. Then would that be a symbolic vote? Yes. But do we still lose dignity when we vote for people who refuse to take us seriously? Of course.
Yes.
But
So,
we can't go to the right.
yeah.
We can't create another left formation that might be successful. So many of us try to work with the Democrats even though we're critical of them at the same time.
So it seems like you don't feel that it's possible for us to leverage our political power.
Oh no, we have to leverage the power we possess. There's no question. And we have to strategically do so. And I understand people who are talking about strategic voting. It's just that I didn't think it was effective when you say don't fight for the presidency, don't vote there, just leave that blank and vote down ballot. I get that, but that's the squandering of real political potential there. Because if we can, if we would have put Hillary in office, and look, if she had 3 more million votes than Donald Trump did, she should be the president. But in this discombobulated darn system we have, even though he didn't win the popular vote, he ended up winning the presidency, Boy, we should fix that. We should fix the rigged system. He talks about a system being rigged, but he thinks it's against him. No, you're part of a rigged system, right? Those delegates and how they are, determined, and, the votes as they are apportioned harkens back to enslavement for us in this country. So, yeah, I think that there's real potential for us to leverage our significant authority, but we have to be strategic about it.
Yeah. Well, it just seems to me that this is that familiar narrative where, it's black folks who come to the rescue of the Democrats,
Of course.
And if we don't show up, then things don't go our way, and then we're stuck. I want to switch gears and talk about the 400 years that have gone by since the first slaves arrived in 1619, and now we're looking at the 400 years having gone by, and we have a new awareness of our relationship to Africa thanks to a film called Black Panther. I'm just curious about what your vision is for the next 400 years, given the awareness that we have now and the reception that we are getting from some of the African leaders who want to see us come back.
Well, blackness has always been bigger than the outlines of our literal interpretation of what Africa might mean. A lot of us were ignorant about Africa in general, ashamed of it, you African booty scratcher. We were saying it among ourselves, right? We were denigrating Africa, not learning about Africa, not studying about Africa, not hearing Africa, and romanticizing it on the other hand. When, as one of my, colleagues said, you go to Africa, you're black, like, you got any Nikes? What's up? Right? During a particular point. In other words, it was demystified for him. It was demythologized for him. It wasn't just, oh my God, I'll return home and I'll be received with open arms. No, you're seen as an American, right? So there are many, many barriers and obstacles to the relationship between Africans in the continent and on the continent and those in the States, in North America. But having said that, yeah, there's the notion in Wakanda that blackness is bigger than our stereotypes, our visions, our limits. It's the horizon of our sight. It's bigger than that. Wakanda forever. Wakanda, an imaginary African homeland, teaches us more about the need to pursue knowledge of the real homeland and love for the real people in the real homeland, and how we should embrace our African identities, and why it was so important, that film, for us as Americans to feel that we had a connection to something deeper and broader and wider than us. And that's a beautiful feeling. All of us should have it, and it should be fulfilled. And so, it betokens and gestures toward black people feeling something bigger, a commitment to something bigger than themselves. And open to the possibility that we have to learn more about this African terrain. It's a triangulation between British culture, between American culture here, between Caribbean culture. I mean, one black destination doesn't have the potential to exhaust black destiny. and the understanding of who we are as a people. So in that sense, Wakanda Forever pointed toward, gestured toward a rethinking of blackness. And it's bigger than our narrow beliefs. You know, if Trump has taught us anything, is that black people shouldn't rest upon a narrow conception of what blackness is. We should embrace trans black people and gay and lesbian black people and queer black people and women and poor folk. We should rethink our identities because they're so much more rich and complex and nuanced than we had heretofore believed. So I think that Wakanda and the Black Panther and the like opens up not a can of worms, but a can of possibilities. And what we have to do is to survey them, embrace them, and learn as much as we can about the black people we claim to love.
Okay. You are an intellectual, you're a minister. I'm just curious about what you feel is your most effective way of reaching black people and lifting them up.
Well, I try to write, I try to talk, I try to speak, I try to preach, I try to go around the country bearing witness to it. I give talks at schools and lectures at universities and speak for political organizations and write. I love it all. I preach on Sunday mornings as I've done today. So I love it all. And there are different, virtues to different forms of expression and communication. There's the immediacy of speaking or lecturing and preaching where the amens and the support of the people, make a huge difference and feed you and fuel you, and that call and response is tremendous. The electrifying interplay between the pulpit and the pew, all of that is great. But I love writing as well. The best writer is a rewriter. Sometimes you don't even know what you think until you start writing. And so I take great pains to try to get better each time, to learn more, to reflect what I learned more on the page, to be a better writer, more eloquent, more, insightful than the previous book. And I hope I'm elevating my game way high because I want to do that as an example to young people of what happens when you devote yourself to a craft over a number of years, 30 some odd years. And, I've been speaking in public since I've been 11 years old. I won the oratorical contest in my high school in Weber Junior High. Then I won the, school contest there, and then the regional contest. So I was able to, the district contest, I was able to really do well by being mentored by teachers, for whom I was proud to associate myself with when I won the school spelling bee championship in the 5th and 6th grades, and then the oratorical contest in the 7th and 8th grades. So, all those forms of communication are critical to me. I want to become a better writer, speaker, thinker, and everything I turn my hand to and my eye to, I just try to get better.
Okay, 2 final questions. We're living in a time in which a lot of people are becoming disenchanted with church. You mentioned yesterday Paula White, Joel Osteen, and being pro-Trump pastors and having significantly large black constituency, so to speak. What are your feelings about the effectiveness as the church as an agent of political and social change right now?
Well, as Robert McAfee Brown said, the church is like Noah's Ark. If it wasn't for the storm on the outside, you couldn't stand the stink on the inside. So it's a problem out here. The church is in turmoil, but the church is a sanctuary still. It might be like Noah's Ark. There's a storm on, there's a stink on the inside, but there's a storm out there. When people tell me, as the Reverend William Augustus Jones said, the late great preacher, when people said, oh, there's hypocrites in the church, well, come on, join us. There's always room for one more. So obviously I have my criticisms of the black church, but it's still a great institution. It's still a great force for good. And we have to check its homophobia, its transphobia, its anti-queer beliefs, its sexism, its patriarchy, its misogyny, its classism. All that stuff is true to a certain degree. But like with this church, when you find a church that's insightful and creative and imaginative and on the cutting edge, you've got a great force for good. And I take, consolation from the fact that this church, like many others, will continue to be on the cutting edge and will continue to define for us as a people what goodness and brightness and compassion are, and how we reach out beyond our borders, reach out beyond our sanctuaries. If we're going to be serious about serving God, we got to do it in the community, not simply in the church.
Okay, and last question.
Mm-hmm.
You and Dr. West, have you mended the fence, so to speak?
You know, we've had a conversation since I wrote my piece, and as we always do when we see each other, it's fine, hail fellow, well met. But there's been no substantive art, negotiation terms, so to speak, and an honest conversation about what I felt was his out-of-bounds behavior. And look, I took that behavior for 5 years. People ask, when would I sit down? Would I ever sit down? I said, I've always been the one willing to sit down. It's him who hasn't been willing to sit down. People we knew both in common tried to arrange it. He said yes, but never show up. They tried to do a public thing at Howard University to be a fundraiser that the reconciliation of Dyson and West would lead toward a fundraiser for Black Lives Matter. Never did it. So I can honestly say I've been the one who's been more than willing to sit down, to have a talk, to have a conversation. And I think that I still have high regard for Professor West and his extraordinary talent and genius and what he represents, but he also went off the rails, and he also said horrible things about people. And look, I could say those about Trump, but Trump is a sworn enemy. He and I were ostensibly, supposedly friends, colleagues, mentor and mentee. And for 5 years I held my powder, didn't say a word when he attacked me, insulted me, called me a prostitute, said I was pimping poor people. I turned my back on them. Listening to my sermon today, could that be seen as true? So it was unfortunate. But then, because he had been so fastidious and invested in his argument, I had to drop 10,000 words on him, first in the New Republic and then in my latest book, what truth sounds like, to really argue against his kind of special variety of hypocrisy, always speaking about Christian love and love can overcome things, and yet can't sit down with your brother to work things out at the same religious table and under the same ecclesiastical canopy. So it's unfortunate.
Yes.
But I still hold out, not only hope, but I still am willing to sit down with Professor West and try to talk honestly about some of these issues.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, first of all, and last of all, for taking this time with me, because I know it came at a tremendous sacrifice, and I know you're probably ready to have some lunch or whatever precedes that. Thank you for coming to Cleveland. Thank you for sharing your gifts with us.
All right. Thank you so much.
It's so important. And, when we think about leadership, we don't look at our intellectuals as leadership, but you are right there on the